Muchas gracias. Thank you very much for coming out on this windy and cold Saturday afternoon. And we've all come here because we know that something is happening in Venezuela. And it's the country that in the 21st century has built 2 million units of social housing. 2 million. No other country in the world has done this. No other country. In Toronto, you will remember just a few months ago, housing activists were lobbying the municipal government to make available 1,000 additional beds, shelter beds, for the homeless. So we've had a record number of people who have died this winter in Toronto, and we're looking for 1,000 additional beds. Venezuela has built, in the 21st century, 2 million homes. And yet, nobody outside this room, or very few people outside this room, here in Toronto, know about this. What would happen if the housing activists in Toronto knew that this is what's actually going on in a country that is not even a member of the G7? It doesn't have the wealth of Canada. And yet, it is able to deliver housing, healthcare, education, and dignity to the majority of the population. And I say the majority because there's a few of them who we know are causing problems. And this is why we're all here today. Thank you very much again for coming. We have two amazing speakers this afternoon. This is an event that is organized by the Bolivarian Circle Louis Riel, and it is also sponsored by the Latin American Solidarity Network and the Canadian and Latin American and Caribbean Policy Center. So I would like to turn it over to Maria Paez Victor, la doctora Maria Paez Victor, who is a distinguished professor who's now retired, authored, and human rights activist, and the #1 defender of the people's achievements in Venezuela here in Toronto. Vamos a darle un aplauso a la doctora Victor.
Thank you very much, Juan. You're too kind. Friends, compañeros, good afternoon to you all. Buenas tardes, gracias por estar aquí. Thank you so much for being here today, expressing your solidarity with Venezuela, a country that is being besieged by the power of the United States and its allies, including Canada. The economic war being waged against Venezuela is brutal. Sabotage, hoarding, smuggling, fires, street gang violence, paramilitary raids on farmers and food delivery trucks, destroying the electricity lines, black market, and monetary manipulations. The object is to destroy the Venezuelan economy and bring down the legitimate democratic government. This economic war by the United States is not new. They did the same thing in Guatemala in the 50s, El Salvador in the 80s, Chile in the 70s, and they're still trying in Cuba today. The sanctions imposed on Venezuela impeded from buying, selling, paying its international debts, and even obtaining its own revenues from its own US-based oil company, Citgo. Right now, as we speak right now, there are large ships loaded with medicine and food. They are just languishing outside the port of La Guaira, and they are unable to unload because of fear of the sanctions. Now, the reason for this war are twofold. First of all, is that Venezuela has the largest deposit of petroleum in the world. It is larger than the one in Saudi Arabia. And powerful countries and oil companies wish to totally control it. They resent that the Venezuelan Bolivarian government considers oil a patrimony of its people, not corporations. and is using the revenues from the oil for social needs. Former Secretary of State Tillerson, who recently headed ExxonMobil, had a particular interest in bringing down Venezuela, as Exxon is the only major oil company that isn't present in Venezuela because it refused to accept the country's constitutional control over its natural resources. Secondly, Venezuela is a bad example for capitalism. Its Bolivarian revolution has clear achievements, securing Venezuelan sovereignty over its oil and its natural resources, providing valuable public services for its people with that oil revenue, the 2 million houses that have been built, free education from daycare to university. If Venezuela can have that, why can't we have it here? Its participatory democracy and protection of human rights, reducing poverty and exclusion, its stated desire for a socialist system, not a capitalist one, and its remarkable inroads towards regional and solidarity and integration. I'm sure you have all read the atrocious coverage of Venezuela in the Canadian media, full of lies and exaggerations. One would think that people are dying on the streets there. Instead, just this week, we learned that extreme poverty has been reduced once again, and it now stands at amazingly 4.4%, even in these hard times. Why? Because the social net has government priority. Now, the media coverage is not generally based on Canadian viewpoints, since its sources come overwhelmingly from the regurgitation of biased reports in the New York Times, Reuters, United Press, and USA pundits. It is a shame that our media outlets rely on foreign USA views on Latin America and the Caribbean. However, last week, Metro and the Toronto Star surprised us by publishing an excellent article on Venezuela written by that brilliant journalist, Linda McQuaig, who, by the way, is the only major Canadian journalist ever to be granted an interview by President Hugo Chavez. Well, a barrage of vituperative Twitter insults fell upon her for having the audacity to write something positively about Venezuela. For those of us who have chosen to live in this beautiful land of Canada, with its peace-loving and generous people that has welcomed so many of us with open arms, it is a source of great distress to see the present federal government engaged in illegal sanctions, clearly to effect regime change in Venezuela. Venezuela is a country that has never demonstrated anything but friendship towards Canada, that is no threat whatsoever to the Canadian people or their interests. These sanctions are in direct violation of the fundamental principles of the United Nations and the Organization of American States. In other words, of international law, as they impinge on a country's sovereignty and their internal affairs. Minister Chrystia Freeland has stomped all over the ideals held in the Canadian imagination of fair dealing, respect of international law, and peacekeeping. Freeland's hostile policy towards Venezuela frontally contradicts Canada's traditional constructive engagement approach. She's prepared to stoop very low indeed and drag down the reputation of this fine country just to get on the good side of Trump, that is, if he has one. All this to preserve NAFTA, whatever its shortcomings may be. I am of the mind that Freeland would never have found any role in the cabinets of Pierre Trudeau or Jean Chrétien. Let us remember, as we discuss the illegal, and I would say forthrightly, the immoral USA, EU, and Canadian sanctions against Venezuela, that the government of the day is not Canada. By political convention, it may represent the country, but Canada's people are greater than any particular administration. Today, we will be discussing Canada's foreign policy, and it behooves us to understand that the Ministry of Foreign Affairs is among all the ministries the most unresponsive to ordinary citizens. For us, it is shrouded in secrecy with very little attempt to really consult the citizens on whose behalf they are making portentous decisions. Now, we have organized this event today to alert Canadians of the damage that Minister Freeland is doing to a democratic, peaceful, and friendly country in their name. Now, I am honored to present one of Canada's finest political authors and analysts, who has come all the way from Montreal just to speak to us, Mr. Yves Engler. His analysis of Canadian foreign policy is unsurpassed. Yves Engler is the author of a seminal book called The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy. And in this book, Yves has stated, and I quote, "From its inception, the Canadian Foreign Service reflected a bias towards economic concerns. Therefore, it is the business elite that has the most access to the workings of that ministry." Yves has been described as Canada's Noam Chomsky, and indeed, Chomsky himself has said of him, and I quote, "Yves Engler's penetrating inquiry yields a rich trove of valuable evidence about Canada's role in the world and poses a challenge for citizens who are willing to take their fundamental responsibilities seriously." So Yves Engler has much to teach us today about the workings of the federal government and may shed light as to why this appalling aggression has occurred at this time from one democracy to another in this our hemisphere. Friends, I ask you to please give a very warm welcome to our honored guest, Yves Engler.
Thanks, Maria, for that. Thanks, everyone, for coming out, and obviously thanks to the organizers for putting this on. Considering where we are, considering where we are in the, to some extent, the sort of belly of the beast on Canadian foreign policy, with our foreign minister, with people like Peter Munk and the Munk School of Global Affairs not far away. It's very important that we build this solidarity movement to respond to what is quite clearly a Canadian effort at regime change in Venezuela. And let's be clear, this is not something about democracy. This is not a question about the folks at Foreign Affairs caring about hunger or caring about all the things that they talk about, human rights violations, etc. This is about not liking a government because it doesn't follow orders, it doesn't follow the model that they want to see that government follow. That's not to say that everything that government has ever done is perfect, but that is overwhelmingly a question for Venezuelans to decide, to debate, to discuss. It's not a question for governments like ours to try to precipitate changes in regimes. And the context, we have to, obviously people in this room probably are familiar with the broad context as Maria talked about, but we're talking about a situation where Donald Trump is just musing openly about invading Venezuela. We're talking about a context where the U.S. military has, in the summer, talking about U.S. military upcoming military exercises literally miles away from, in Trinidad and Tobago, miles away from the border. We're talking about a context where Rex Tillerson is openly talking about prodding the Venezuelan military to intervene. Top U.S. senators doing the same. A context of aggressive antagonism because they smell blood. Right? They smell blood, they sense the government is weak, and they want to push their, they think they have an opportunity to push it. And our government has participated in this process of trying to weaken, isolate, demonize, overthrow the Venezuelan government by just the repeated attacks. Anyone take a look at Chrystia Freeland's Twitter account, over and over again. talking about the dictatorial intentions, the robbing of fundamental democratic rights in Venezuela. Recently, she publicly supported Peru's decision to not have Nicolas Maduro attend the upcoming Summit of the Americas in Peru. And she said that as Venezuela slides deeper into dictatorship and as Venezuelans continue to suffer, Maduro's participation at a hemispheric leaders summit would have been partial. And that Maduro flagrantly disregards the Quebec Declaration of 2001 Summit of the Americas about democracy. Now, of course, Christian Freeland doesn't have a problem with the president of Brazil attending, who doesn't even have a pretense of electoral legitimacy, and doesn't have a problem with the president of Honduras attending, who just won highly dubious elections. The Trudeau government has expelled Venezuelan diplomatic officials, has put out warnings about traveling to Venezuela to try to hype up danger, chaos kind of argumentations. Is obviously part of the Lima group of oppositional foreign ministers to the Venezuelan government. It's participated in, I think, 5 or 6 different Lima group meetings in different countries, including one here in Toronto. And I think probably some of the people in this room were there as part of the protests against that meeting, where they're basically plotting, trying to build the international campaign against the Venezuelan government. The Lima Group and Christian Freeland has said that we're not going to recognize upcoming elections in Venezuela. And they said that they wouldn't recognize, Freeland said they wouldn't recognize the elections in Venezuela for 3 reasons. This is back in at the end of January. One, that the elections were happening too quickly. There's never been a snap election in Canada, of course. That's never happened. The election's happening too quickly. Secondly, that there needs to be full international observer participation. And thirdly, that all Venezuelans have to be able to participate. And she's really on her Twitter and statement, she's really brought up the idea that the snap election, it's too quick, it's unjust. And then, once the election was postponed, Freeland's response was that Maduro regime's decision to postpone Venezuela's elections until May changes nothing. When the Venezuelan government is pushing hard for international observers, of course we know that quietly the US, Canadian, and other governments are trying to block election observers because they don't want anything that can be democratic, they want to be able to demonize it as an unjust process. So the Freeland government, though, is going beyond that. They're pressuring Caribbean countries that Canada traditionally has power with, to join the Lima Group, to join the campaign of trying to isolate Venezuela. Freeland talks about, again, on her Twitter account, meeting with the Costa Rican foreign minister to discuss Venezuela. So that's all she announces about her meeting with the Costa Rican foreign minister. It's just Venezuela is the most important thing between Canada and Costa Rica. Canada's just recently participated in a group of 20 finance leaders, some of the side session of the group of 20 finance ministers meeting, discussing with EU, UK, US officials about Venezuela, and there's another upcoming meeting that the Americans are sponsoring on that front. So there really is a campaign there's activism. Freeland is clearly taking an activist approach to this issue globally, and building international hostility. Obviously, we know that they brought in sanctions in September. 40 Venezuelan officials were added to a sanctions list. Assets frozen in Canada. Canadians have barred from having financial relationships with 40 individuals, top officials in Venezuela, including the head of the Electoral Council, right? Put on the sanctions list, trying to intimidate just imagine if Russia was to put head of Canada's Electoral Council on a sanctions list, how that would be perceived as anti-democratic, try to scare, intervene explicitly with the Electoral Council. Then, subsequent to the initial phase of sanctions, another 19 Venezuelan officials were sanctioned 2 months later under the Magnitsky Act. These sanctions, of course, contravene international law. They contravene OAS principles. And how Friedland justified the sanctions, explained Canada's involvement in, or passing sanctions, said, quote, "Canada is a country that has a strong reputation in the world, as a country that has very clear and cherished democratic values, as a country that stands up for human rights. To be sanctioned by Canada, I think, has real symbolic significance." And that's, I think, important. This, in part, was providing cover for the US sanctions that preceded the Canadian sanctions. And so Canada is really taking a role at that level. And then we know that Canada's supporting opposition forces in Venezuela. And they're actually like incredibly open about it. So Canada's ambassador, Ben Roswell, when he resigned in August, he told, just after he resigned, he told the Ottawa Citizen, quote, "We established quite a significant internet presence inside Venezuela so that we could then engage tens of thousands of Venezuelan citizens in a conversation on human rights. We became one of the most vocal embassies in speaking out on human rights issues and encouraging Venezuelans to speak out." Again, just imagine if the Russian ambassador said that. That's what they were doing in Canada. I mean, it's open interference in Venezuelan affairs. How much money, we're talking about millions of dollars in recent years that Canada has spent in supporting oppositional groups. The full total, I don't know. It's something that definitely deserves a great deal more investigation. One example that's the government has on its own website is a $125,000 Canadian funding to local initiatives program that it says was, quote, projects with high visibility and impact on human rights and the rule of law, including enabling Venezuelan citizens to anonymously register and to denounce corruption abuses by government officials and police through a mobile phone application 2014-15. So they say this openly on their website, and of course, you know, the more quiet affairs that are going on would probably be even more scandalous. One example I noted just in this process, so just 2 weeks ago, Raúl Herrera, who's the director of the Centro para la Paz y los Derechos Humanos, received a Canadian Embassy Human Rights Award, right? Immediately, when I punch his name into Google, look around, of course, he vehemently attacks the government, saying in Spanish, el Estado venezolano viola sistemáticamente y reiteradamente los derechos humanos de los venezolanos y los presos políticos. So basically, the state systematically violates human rights. And so this is who we give. This is about giving credibility to oppositional forces. This is about providing the Canadian stamp of approval for oppositional groups. Again, this is not to say that, you know, all questions of human rights are perfect within Venezuela, et cetera, et cetera. It's to say that this is a completely one-sided affair going on by our government. Other places that have worse human rights violations, where politicians are less popular, we're not putting in money, we're not putting in resources, efforts to try to demonize, isolate, have our foreign minister go after them. And this isn't just new. This isn't just a Trudeau government process. This goes back multiple years, decade more. So for instance, in 2010, Rights and Democracy gave its John Humphrey Award to Venezuelan NGO Provea, oppositional group. When the officials from Provea came, they did a tour, they gave a $30,000 grant, then they did a tour of those officials to Canada. The head of Rights and Democracy, which I should say Rights and Democracy is a Canadian government-funded, appointed, organized organization that actually no longer exists. It's sort of the equivalent, if people are familiar with the National Endowment for Democracy in the US, it was sort of Canada's equivalent to that. The National Endowment for Democracy was a something that was sort of established to promote democracy, which is basically promote governments that the U.S. Or work to undermine governments that the U.S. opposes. As the head of the former head of the individual who established the National Endowment for Democracy said, they did much of what the CIA used to do openly. And during the trip of Provet officials to Canada, Gérard Latourtoup, who was the head of Rights and Democracy at the time, referred to Venezuela as having no democracy. That's back in 2010. Earlier, we have the head of Sumate, Maria Corina Machado, who back in 2005 was invited to Canada. This is somebody who signed that Carmona decree during the 2002 coup, somebody who was engaged in the referendum to get rid of the Chavez government. And Canada gave a $22,000 donation to Sumate at that time, and the International Cooperation Minister at the time, Canada, José Vernet, said, quote, "Canada considers Sumate to be an experienced NGO with the capability to promote respect for democracy." Right, again, so the head of that organization had just signed the post-coup Carmona decree that ended democracy in Venezuela. Machado has also met with John Baird, the former Canadian foreign minister. A couple of individuals have done some good research on Canada's role in funding oppositional groups, the so-called democracy promotion in Venezuela. People can take a look at Neil Burin's article, a very good academic article, Anthony Fenton's article, for more details. I don't know a sum, but certainly millions of dollars over the past decade or more even of Canada funding oppositional groups in Venezuela, groups that are clearly aligned against the elected government. During the Harper government, of course, Harper at one point was asked the question about Venezuela in 2009, and his response was, "I don't take any of these rogue states lightly," right, referring to Venezuela as a rogue state. You had Peter Kent going to Venezuela in 2010, supporting oppositional group. Peter Kent being the minister for the Americas at that time. So there has been, this is not new, right? Canada's work to undermine. What's different, I think, is that they smell blood, right? They smell weakness, and Chrystia Freeland has really ramped up the campaign because they think that it's possible to win regime change at this point. Now, during the Lima Group meeting in the fall here in Toronto, there were protests, and again, I presume some people in this room were at those protests. Chrystia Freeland did this event at that meeting, sort of a discussion, a back and forth, I think with a Monk School of Global Affairs academic, about Canada's position in Venezuela, a number of different international issues, mostly around Venezuela, sort of after the Lima Group meeting. And in that, the questioner asked one question, at least kind of went in the right direction of trying to hold her a little bit to account and saying basically, are we involved, I don't think he actually used the word regime change, but are we involved in trying to undermine the Venezuelan government? And there's lots of people who still support the Bolivarian process, and there's people outside protesting right here in Toronto that policy. And Freeland's response was quite indicative, or quite illuminating in terms of how Canadian politicians try to basically bamboozle the public on what our real foreign policy is. Her response was, quote, "Canada has never been an imperialist power. It's even almost funny to say that phrase. We've been the colony." Then she went on to say, one of the strengths Canada brings to its international affairs is that it doesn't engage in, quote, regime change, right? So basically, it might look and quack like a regime change promoting Canadian duck, but in fact, it's a cuddly Canadian beaver that's just trying to help out the Venezuelans. And so it's not factually true in the current case, but it's not factually true if you take a little bit of a look at history either. For instance, 2011, I think we were engaged in, I think actually it was a Canadian military commander that led the bombing regime change effort in Libya. I think that happened to be a Canadian general. Those Canadian fighter jets were part of that. Staying closer to the dynamics of what's going on in Venezuela, of a of a progressive government being targeted in a US-backed coup, there's many examples of Canada either passively or actively involved in regime change efforts. You go back to 54 with Goulart in Guatemala. Arbenz in Guatemala. I'm not saying it was significant Canadian support, but Pearson was asked about it in House of Commons. At that time, Lester Pearson was our foreign minister. He refused to say that it was a U.S. invasion. The U.S. were involvement in invasion. Previous to that, participated in the isolation of the Arbenz government by refusing to set up embassies in each other's countries. That wasn't just sort of haphazard. These are conscious decisions. There were significant Canadian economic interests that go back decades in Guatemala with the United Fruit Company. It was Canadian interests that built the United Fruit Company's railroad, which is a very controversial issue. In 64, in Brazil, the coup against Goulart, as the book Brazil and Canada in the Americas explains it, quote, "The Canadian reaction to the military coup of 1964 was careful, polite, and allied with American rhetoric. There were substantive Canadian corporate interests in Brazil. Brascan, it was called the Canadian octopus because it had its tentacles in so many areas of Brazil's economy. In fact, it was considered to be the biggest, at one point, the biggest corporation in Latin America. Canada had also soft support for the passive support, maybe beyond passive support, for the coup invasion process in the Dominican Republic in 65, 62 with Juan Bosch. Canada actually sent a naval vessel in that process, and Pearson in the House of Commons, at that point Prime Minister, said that the United States government has intervened in the Dominican Republic for the protection of its own citizens and those of other countries. That was the reason, that was the motivation Washington had, the protection of citizens. You take a look at Allende in 73, a bit more active Canadian support in that case of the coup. There's the famous cable that Canada's ambassador published or sent to Ottawa just after the coup, when there's thousands of people, tens of thousands of people being locked up in the stadium and being tortured, killed, etc. And our ambassador, Andrew Ross, said, quote, "Reprisals and searches have created panic atmosphere affecting particularly expatriates, including the riffraff of the Latin American left, to whom Allende gave asylum. The country has been on a prolonged political binge under the elected Allende government, and the junta has assumed the probably thankless task of sobering Chile up." That was a sobering up process that lasted for almost 2 decades. Immediately, 3 weeks after, recognized Pinochet's dictatorship. Canada had cut off different forms of financial support through the IMF, Inter-American Development Bank, during the Allende government. Immediately after, those restarted. So you had a bit more than passive Canadian involvement in that coup. In 2012 in Paraguay with Fernando Lugo, similarly, Canada was one of the first countries to recognize I think it was called a constitutional coup, or a bit more active in 2009 with Manuel Zelaya in Honduras. Canada took a bit more active process in that coup. Sorry. I'm getting to my final example is going to be in Haiti. So in 2009 with Zelaya, Canada, the Harper government criticized the Zelaya government beforehand. It was one of the, I think, the only major donor that didn't at least announce cutting off of aid to the post-military government. Canada's small military training program with the Honduran military that just ousted the government, they continued that process, signed a free trade agreement with Honduras not long after. So they took the Harper government took a fairly active role in supporting the coup there, blamed Zelaya for the violence when he tried to return to the country, on and on and on. Legitimated the post-coup election, dubious election. Now, the clearest example of Canada's role in overthrowing a progressive, not mild reformist, not a radical, actually a priest, was in the government in the case of 2004 in Haiti, right, where Canada was engaged at every level, militarily, diplomatically, with our aid, police, in the ouster, the plotting even of the coup, and then the ouster, and then thousands of people being killed in post-coup violence. There was actually a meeting organized on January 31st, 2003, and February 1st of that year, where the Canadian government brought high-level officials from the Bush administration, from the French government, and the OAS to discuss Haiti's future. No one from Haiti's elected government was invited to discuss Haiti's future. At that meeting, they decided, as was reported on by L'Actualité magazine, which is Quebec's equivalent to Maclean's magazine, on March 15th, 2003, they decided that Aristide must go, Haiti should be put under UN trusteeship, the Haitian military should be recreated. 13 months later, slightly under a year after the article was published, US, French, Canadian troops invade Haiti, pluck the elected president and dump him in the Central African Republic. US Marines do that. Canadian Special Forces at the airport when that happens, the night it happens, then 550 Canadian troops on the ground supporting a government headed by somebody who had been living in Florida for almost 2 decades. They literally just took him from Florida. Yeah, they're a Haitian president, or they're Haitian, in that case, prime minister. The Canada supported financially. We cut off our aid to the Aristide government, and then when there's an unelected government killing thousands of people, huge increase in Canadian aid, first ever trip by a Canadian prime minister, not when there's elected government, when the post-coup. And even the officials, the top officials of the government were employees of our aid agency. The head of the Justice Ministry was an employee of USAID. The Deputy Justice Minister was an employee of CEDA, our aid agency, while the Constitutional Prime Minister, while the Constitutional Interior Minister, and hundreds of other political prisoners were languishing in Haitian jails, while the Haitian police were repeatedly firing on unarmed demonstrations. And so Canada played a very important role in that 2004 coup and then the subsequent 2 years of political violence that left thousands of people dead. So it's completely ridiculous what Chrystia Freeland says about Canada being, against regime change or never involved in regime change. There's an abundance of evidence suggesting that Canada has been involved in regime change in the hemisphere. Now, moving towards a conclusion, unfortunately on this issue right now with Canada's campaign of regime change against Venezuela, we have an opposition, an NDP in this country that has, rather than actually being an opposition, is in some cases even cheer-led for Canada to be more aggressive against the Venezuelan government. So Hélène Lavadière, who's the foreign critic for the NDP, has put out press release bemoaning, quote, the erosion of democracy and the need for Canada to, quote, defend democracy in Venezuela. About 6 months ago, she, in a House of Commons meeting, she referred to Venezuela's vice president as a, quote, drug lord, whose the American government has seized billions of dollars of his assets for drug trafficking. That's a quote from the foreign critic of the NDP. She's put out a number of press releases going back to 2013, all going in this direction of we need to get harder on the Venezuelan government. So it really is a dire scenario on that front. The one positive in the response, I think Lavadière is going to back off a bit on this front because at the recent NDP convention, the NDP Socialist Caucus put forward a resolution for Lavadière to be removed as foreign critic for what she was doing primarily in Venezuela, but a number of other places. Obviously, they didn't allow that resolution to be debated at the convention, but it's certainly put, I think, the question. This is the first time ever an NDP critic apparently has been asked to be removed in a resolution to convention. So it's obviously there's a dissent within the NDP on that front. Now, to get the sense of the why question, why is Canada engaged in this process? I think Maria detailed that pretty well. I mean, there really are two questions. There is the oil and the wealth and the profits that are potential to be made with the oil. And then, and I actually think the second one is ultimately even more important. It's the sort of threat of a good example, or it's the not following orders, however exactly you want to frame that. And so Canada has supported. Canada, and my estimation of Canadian foreign policy is not, Ottawa is not just doing this because Washington orders us to do this. Yes, there are instances Washington puts pressure on Ottawa to follow this type of policy, but my reading of Canadian foreign policy history is that the Canadian elite see the world and profit from the world in a very similar way to the US elite, right? Yes, there are instances where there is some pressure coming from Washington, but overwhelmingly, this is the world they want to see. The Washington elite viewpoint is the world they want to see. In the context of Venezuela, there's been some substantive Canadian corporate players who have been angered by the Chavez government, by the Bolivarian governments. So for instance, in 2007, Peter Monk, who is the head of or is the founder of the most prestigious foreign policy school in this country, the Monk School of Global Affairs, quite an influential institution. Peter Monk said, he wrote a letter to the Financial Times. Says, I don't think it's every day that billionaires take the time out to write letters to newspapers. But he said in a letter that the Financial Times titled as "Stop Chavez's demagoguery before it's too late," Monk said, quote, "Your editorial, Chavez in Control, was way too benign a characterization of a dangerous dictator, the latest of a type who takes over a nation through the democratic process and then perverts or abolishes it to perpetuate his own power. Aren't we ignoring the lessons of history and forgetting that the dictators Hitler, Mugabe, Pol Pot, and so on became heads of state by democratic process?" And then he continued on to heap more scorn on Venezuela's government. In another instance, he said that he would prefer to invest in Western Pakistan, where Taliban was at that point in control, rather than in Venezuela or in Bolivia, because those leftist governments in Venezuela and Bolivia were such a threat. And he framed it very much as wanting to punish, right, those countries, because again, that model, they were pursuing a model of economic development, social development, that Peter Monk very well understood was not a model that was going to serve his and his friends' interests, not just tomorrow, but 5, 6, 10, 20, and whatever years down the road. It was a very class-conscious kind of view that Peter Monk was articulating on the question of Venezuela. So the Canadian ruling class is aligned with this type of outlook, and I think there's maybe some argument to be made that they're more aggressive today than if you go back 50 whatever years. I think to some extent that's just that we're more aware of what's going on internationally. I think if we were had access to the media outlets as well back in the time of the coup against Arbenz in Guatemala, I think you'd probably find there's many more details of Canadian involvement that we would have actually known about. But maybe it's true that the Canadian state has become more aggressive and more imperialistic. I think that there could be some truth in that. One of the reasons, of course, is just huge rise of Canadian mining investment around the world, and particularly in Latin America. Canadian mining companies just completely dominate in so many different countries. And those countries have a very clear interest, and it's repeated over and over again in the business press, opposition to what they refer to as resource nationalism, which is really just code for using the resources of a country for those who live in that place. They oppose that, and they do lots of things to try to make sure that governments can't pursue those types of policies. like foreign investment promotion protection agreements to allow companies to sue, which is one of the things that some Canadian mining companies have been suing Venezuela in international tribunal under one of those types of accords. So the Canadian business class and ruling class is very much in favor of this type of policy. And so the question becomes, what are we going to do about it, right? What are the forces that believe in internationalism? What are the forces that believe that Venezuelans should decide their fate are going to do about it? And there's lots of things we can do about it. Obviously, this type of event, popular education, is one of those things. The protests back in the fall against the Lima Group meeting are one of those. But we need to rekindle, we need to rebuild solidarity, in this case specifically around Venezuela, because it's hot and it's real. There's a regime change. The policies that Ottawa and Washington are pursuing, they will have a terrible effect on many people's lives if they're successful. Don't in any way doubt that. There are many examples throughout history suggesting that, and that is the likely course of action. So it's what can we do to make it more difficult for our politicians to pursue those policies. And I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Yves. That was great. Perhaps we could use the rest of the time for questions. And I would imagine that this the two thought-provoking presentations would inspire a few questions from the group. We have one from Freddy Vélez from the newspaper Correo Canadiense. Yes, Freddy.
How do you see if there is any difference between how the conservative government deal with Venezuela now that we have Mr. Trudeau that supposedly is liberal? Because I remember Peter Kemp trying to be very verbal, very vocal about Venezuela, but they didn't go further.
Smelling blood, the sense of weakness in Venezuela, that they see an opportunity to succeed, and so they're willing to take those added steps to try to succeed in terms of regime change. That's my sense. I'm guessing if Harper would have won the last election, fortunately he didn't, policies would have been fairly similar to that. I'm not someone of the opinion this is a question of Chrystia Freeland, she is taking an activist approach in this, but I don't think it's just a personal thing. Like I said, it's a broader kind of class policy in this country. It's what motivates Canadian foreign policy more generally. That's not to say, of course, that targeting Chrystia Freeland, punishing her for what she's been doing in Venezuela, especially considering where she's a politician, that wouldn't be a very good response to what she would do. We need to make politicians know that there can be costs for what they do internationally. That's one of the not to go into this too far, one of the things I'm kind of proudest about politically. I was part of a group called Haiti Action Montreal, where in the 2006 election, we were able to punish Pierre Pettigrew with a hard campaign. We put up 2,000 posters with his picture saying wanted for crimes against humanity in Haiti in his riding in Montreal, handed out 15,000 leaflets. He lost that election actually to a woman of Haitian descent, Bloc Québécois MP, and La Presse, Le Devoir said that our campaign contributed to him losing. Now, ultimately, these policies go way beyond the individuals, so it's a broader kind of movement that we need to build, but those types of campaigns can be useful, one, for popular education, two, for just putting a little bit of an idea in the back of the head of these politicians that they can find, they can be punished for those policies.
Thank you.
Maria, did you wish to add something?
Well, one thing that Yves has said, which is really important, is that mining is crucial to the business elite in Canada. Canada, in fact, has been called the mining capital of the world. And the community, the Latin American community, we had a meeting with Mr. Peter Kent of sad memory. And I remember that he told us, when we asked him, I asked him, do you think that we could pass a law in Canada that would oblige the mining companies to act in other countries like they are obliged to act here in terms of protecting the rights of Indigenous peoples and the rights of the environment? Because the Canadian mining companies are doing a lot of damage in these two areas in Latin America. He had the audacity to just lie to us right there and say, my Canadian mining companies don't do that. You are very mistaken, you know. I said to him, can I send you some evidence and some information on it? He said, yes. I said, will you read it? Of course, to this day, he never answered. So they are closing in on simply protecting the mining companies. And this is really sad, because it's not as if the mining companies are sharing their profits with the rest of us citizens here. No, because this is the belly of the beast. This is capitalism. Whatever they get, you know, they are really obtaining things for themselves. So I think we just need to be aware of this. And in the next election, go to the candidates' meetings and inquire, ask them, put them so that they understand the candidates, that we aren't, you know, little lambs that don't know what the hell is going on in Ottawa. We need to find out what's going on in Ottawa, and when the federal elections come, go and confront all the candidates about this. Until we do that, they're going to carry on doing whatever the hell they want.
We have a couple of questions. First from Eusebio, we have Barry, and then we have Vanino over here, and then number 4. So perhaps Eusebio?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, it's been some time since Hugo Chavez was elected for the first time, and since then, I mean, we all know what the U.S. has been doing. We don't know much about what Canada has been doing, but I'm just wondering if there's anyone collecting all this data about, you know, all the funding that they've been providing to violent opposition leaders in Venezuela and other stuff, like the mining stuff. Like, is there enough evidence to take this? And I don't know if this is possible either, but do we have enough evidence to take these governments to international court and accuse them of crimes against humanity? Because basically that's what they've been doing all these years.
It's funny you should say that. The UN representative for human rights has recently come back from Venezuela, and he made these amazing declarations, and I think I have a copy of his declaration. He said that there was no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela, that there were scarcity in certain aspects, but that it is not true that there was any kind of humanitarian need in Venezuela. His name is Alfred de Sayas. And one of the things that he said was that the UN that Venezuela should sue, should take the United Nations to the UN over the sanctions. The sanctions must be terminated, and this is his words, the economic war must end. So this is a major person in the United Nations who has gone. He was about 3 months in Venezuela. He spoke with the opposition, he spoke with NGOs, he spoke with everyone, and he came back understanding what was happening, that there was an economic war. And so he is now urging Venezuela to take the UN the US, I don't see they call it suing, but to bring them to the United Nations and ask that. So yes, there is evidence. And it is being seen not only by academics and organizations, but even by the United Nations. I hope more do what you're saying. I think you're quite right. We need to make this known.
The editors of the Globe and Mail missed it, though.
Yes, they did. that didn't come out.
Barry?
Yeah. Thank you, Yves and Maria, for excellent presentations. This is what's sadly missing in the Canadian mainstream media. My question is to you equally, both. is about the upcoming election in Venezuela. And we know the Canadian establishment has tried to influence past elections in Venezuela by funding certain groups. I know the opposition to the Chavista government in Venezuela is in disarray, some not participating, some debating whether to participate. Are there any signs that Ottawa is trying to influence, or I should say Bay Street, is trying to influence or intervene in the upcoming Venezuelan elections?
Well, I mean, yes, there is there have been get out the vote campaigns that Canada's been involved with, and they weren't trying to get out the Chavez vote. I can guarantee you that in the past. I think my sense of their campaign right now is they're just trying to discredit the election. That's the campaign. There isn't actually the intervention at that level. That's my sense. Maria probably knows better than that.
We live in a topsy-turvy world. Okay, this is outrageous what they've done. Canada, the U.S., the EU, the Organization of American States, led by the unthinkable Almagro, who's just the worst you can imagine, had been pressing Maduro. You have to have presidential elections. There must be presidential elections in Venezuela. The response of the government was, look, it's all in the works. They're scheduled for December 2018. This isn't a parliamentary system. These are dates that are where you have election. And they kept on pressuring and pressuring and pressuring. Meanwhile, they're having a peace talk in Santo Domingo, which was being facilitated by 4 presidents of other nations. And in the negotiations with the opposition, the government said, okay, you want elections. When would you like elections? The opposition leaders said April. So the elections were set for April 20th or something, right? Well, guess what? The United States, the EU, the Organization of American States, all of them, oh my God, we're going to lose. So they said, no, we can't have elections. This is wrong. It's too early. This snap election, it cannot be. This was the date that the opposition had said. So they pressured the government, saying that. So the Maduro government, again, in order to placate them, said, all right, we'll do them on May 20th. Do you agree with that? Is that all right? The opposition said, yes, May 20th. What's the reaction now? We're not going to accept this election. These elections are going to be fraudulent. We're not going to accept this. So no matter what Maduro does, they're going to be against it. So this is the topsy-turvy world in which we are now. Now, the reason is that Maduro's going to win big. Maduro's going to win very big. This is extraordinary, because in most countries, when you have an economic problem, the governments lose. In Venezuela, it's not going to lose, because I know it's the opposition that has created the economic problems. Of course, I'm not saying that the government is perfect and that all its policies have been, wonderful or anything like that. But it's just that when you have leaders of the opposition going around the world begging international banks and the Organization of American States and the EU to please put sanctions on their country. Imagine, these are complete, people who have no sense of their own country. The people of Venezuela aren't stupid. They know it's the opposition who has fought for these sanctions. So I will put a prediction here that the Maduro government, the Bolivarian Revolution, is going to win big the elections on the 20th of May.
I'm wondering if you could say anything about your own observations of how Venezuelan people are responding to the present events. And also, do you think there might be a possibility to have a speaker from Venezuela come here in the coming months?
Okay, thank you. Well, I was in Venezuela just before my accident. I think it was August. And if I just went by what I read, you'd think that you arrive there and you see bodies on the street. it was wonderful to walk along the streets of Caracas. I stayed in Caracas and around Caracas. And on every other corner, there were farmers selling their produce. Lovely little stands full of fruits and vegetables and chickens and eggs and everything. These were the farmers bringing in their stuff. It is true that if you went to a store and you wanted sort of American ketchup or mustard or whatever, they wouldn't be there. But the actual food you could see all over the city. I went to visit the little markets of the Consejos Comunales. The Consejos Comunales are the communal councils. In Venezuela, we don't have a mass of people. There's no mass of people in Venezuela. It's an organized people. Practically everybody belongs to a Consejo Comunal, a commune, a militia, something, you know. It's not just like anonymous people. And the communal councils are the ones that have been feeding the people of Venezuela. I have been to their markets, and they directly come from whoever plants the food, comes and is able to sell it in their little markets, which is great because the middlemen are out. One of the things that people don't understand about Venezuela is that the distribution of food is in hands of the private sector, powerful private sectors, okay? Me, I would have nationalized them a long time ago, but I understand. But you know, I'm not the government. The government is fighting so many, you know, fronts that, you know, I'd say, well, all right, they must have some reason. But that distribution is hands of murderous, really absolutely selfish upper class that is racist, that is classist, that doesn't give a damn about its people, okay? And I mean this not in order to insult them, but to describe them to you, okay? Describe them to you. I speak with Venezuela every day. I have a very big family. I speak with somebody in my family every day. One of the members of my family just came back. There was a party, a kid's party, 3-year-old. This was a wealthy 3-year-old. And in this party, there was everything. There was even, you know, those petting zoos? The whole petting zoo was there. There was food on the table that was, so this is the upper classes. They know where to get the food. They hoard the food. They smuggle the food. And if they are the ones who are selling it, they up the prices. So what I'm trying to say to you is that in Venezuela, there is truly a class war going on. The upper class doesn't give a damn about its people. And I want to say something about what Yves said that is so insightful. The Canadian elite thinks like the US elite. And this is something that a very great intellectual of Canada said, oh, I don't know, maybe 25 years ago. His name was George Grant, and I can't remember the name of the book. Does anybody remember the name of the book of George Grant? He was a great intellectual. Sorry?
Lament for a Nation.
Lament for a Nation. Go to the nearest library that you can and read that book that was written, I think, 30 years ago. The Canadian elite sends its children to Harvard. Canadian elite sends its kids to little prep schools. The Canadian elite thinks it is the US elite, which is hubris, because the US elite doesn't give a fig about the Canadian elite. Okay? But the Canadian elite is the wannabe, okay? And this is a big problem that we have here. This is why in Canada, I cry to think, here we are in Venezuela struggling for our sovereignty. And the people who should be struggling for Canadian sovereignty here don't even know that they're supposed to have sovereignty. Anyway, that's my 2 cents.
Thank you, thank you. I was hoping you could speak about the movies, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised.
The what, sorry?
I was hoping you could speak a little bit about the movies, The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, about
Okay.
the coup,
Yeah.
and also South of the Border, and how you think things have changed or stayed the same in the 10 or 15 years since.
That was a remarkable thing. Imagine as if someone had been at the fall of the Bastille with a little camera and recorded it. These two young people from Ireland, a young man and a young woman, that had heard of this man Chavez and said, let's go down there and see if we can find out what's happening there. So they came with their little camera to Venezuela. They wanted to meet Chavez. Well, Venezuelans being Venezuelans, were very informal. They knocked on the door of the presidential palace and they said, come right in. And so there they were in the presidential palace, talking to people, smiling at them, two nice young people from Ireland. And lo and behold, while they were in that palace, there was a coup. Right there. And nobody thought of throwing them out. They just thought, oh, these two young kids from Ireland, everybody liked them. And they started filming. They filmed when Chavez and his cabinet are sitting there discussing, what are we going to do? There's a coup. All of it was filmed. They filmed the people outside demanding, the return of the government. They filmed the whole thing. If you have not seen The Revolution Will Not Be Televised, please go on the internet, because it's on the internet. It's a remarkable documentary, and it won all kinds of awards. What has happened? Well, as Yves was saying, Canada smells blood. So does the United States. Chavez died. And Chavez, there's no other Chavez, okay? This was a oncer. This was a man larger than life. When I met him, I couldn't believe it. It was like I was looking at Superman or something. I mean, he really is larger than life. And he was charismatic. Just his smile, it was charismatic. And he died. It was a terrible blow. And it was such a terrible blow that the country became paralyzed because nobody really wanted to believe that he could die. And according to the Constitution, when a president dies, you must have an election 30 days after. So all of a sudden, and Chavez has said, look, I want Maduro to run. So Maduro, who had been a civil servant all his life, not all his life because he was a bus driver, but he was a civil servant, right? He had never run a campaign. He had never run for people to vote, because it's the presidential system. So in 30 days, he had to come up with a campaign. He won with the same low percentage, and I can't remember how much it was, about 2%, with which Obama won. But nobody threw this in Obama's face, but they threw it in Maduro's face. So this wasn't a great majority, because it was a shoestring campaign that happened. So the United States and Canada and all their allies think, oh, Maduro is weak. Well, he has shown to be a statesman of the first order. Chavez was not wrong in electing Maduro as his second. Maduro has managed, first of all, to deflect all of these attempts to kill him, attempts to have these guarimbas, these street violence, the attempts by the paramilitary. He has grown in stature and in strength, and the people know that he is the one that is backing them. Whatever mistakes the government ministers may do, or this or the other, it is Maduro who is protecting them. And so, right now, what are two important things that he's done to go against this economic war? One are the bags of food. The bags of food are given twice a month to about 70% of the population. The people receive a bag of subsidized food with grains and milk and whatever they need, the basic thing. This is one of the reasons why, in the midst of this disaster of economics and inflation, poverty has been reduced to 4.4%. And that's extreme poverty. And the general poverty is at 26%. Look at the percentages for other countries, and I can tell you Mexico, Peru, Colombia doesn't have this right now. So Maduro has grown in status, and the people know that it is the Bolivarian government that is the one that is supporting and backing them. So I would say, and when I speak to people in Venezuela, I always say, well, they must be terrible. But most people tell me that people are even more determined to vote for the Chavez government. And right now, although the powers that be want, especially the opposition, don't want people to vote, the latest poll says that 72% of the people say they will go out and vote. Venezuelans like to vote, so they will win.
My question is regarding the Canadian foreign policy towards Latin America. What I am seeing here is a sort of double standards. At one side is condemning the Venezuelan regime as a violator of human rights violators and corruption and things like that. At the other side, we have another regime in Latin America, especially in Honduras, where the violation of human rights is really, really high, and nobody say anything. And the level of crime is the highest in Latin America. The corruption, the lack of institutionality, the ruling president now is controlling everything in the country, from the minimum office to the highest level of the army, police, the court, the judiciary system, anything. But Canada, instead of condemning that regime, but the other way, is an illegitimate regime because the constitution in Honduras do not allow re-election. And this guy, violating the constitution, he ran for election, and by illegal means, he became the president with the support of the American embassy, which declared him president, not the Hondurans. The person in charge of the American embassy in Honduras declared him president. Canada didn't say anything. The opposition, who was supposed to win after the 71% of the vote count, was leading with more than 5%. Suddenly, the system crashed, and they restored the system 14 hours later with the reaching the result. The winner was the loser, and the loser was the winner. And Canada didn't say anything. The American State Organization observers, they said that at that level of counting, the results were irreversible. But happened the opposite with this system that they crashed. So why Canada is supporting this type of regimes? That's my question.
Well, in fact,
I'm sorry, I'm just going to repeat the question comment for the people that are sitting in the back. Essentially, the compañero here is asking, why is it that Canada has a double standard in its foreign policy? On the one hand, you have a situation in Honduras where there was flagrant violation of democratic rights. The election was fraudulent. It's obvious to a lot of people, to the Hondurans. Essentially, the opposition candidate was winning, power goes out. When the power comes back as the official candidate, the Americans recognize it, Canada stays mum. There's been all kinds of persecution of journalists, human rights activists, environmentalists in Honduras, having one of the worst homicide records in the world. And at the same time, Canada chooses to focus on Venezuela. So the question essentially is, for the panelists, can you comment on this double standard?
Well, yeah, I mean, first of all, it's not stayed silent. Chrystia Freeland, very quickly after the Americans endorsed, she put out a tweet endorsing Juan Orlando Hernandez. And Tyler Shipley, who's the author of a book called Ottawa and Empire, Canada and the Coup in Honduras, or something like that, pointed out online that he was surprised. He thought Canada would actually just stay quiet and effectively support, but he was surprised at how quickly Chrystia Freeland endorsed the electoral fraud in Honduras. And of course, you've got to remember that the rationale for the 2009 coup against Manuel Zelaya was that he had proposed a referendum on possibly holding a constitutional assembly to then have a new constitution, and the accusation was that he was planning on running again, right? So that's exactly what Hernandez did. Yeah, I mean, the double standard is this is a universal double standard of Canadian foreign policy, that our allies, their crimes are basically, maybe you find a little comment in page 16, bottom of the page in the Globe and Mail. Our enemies, it's front page of the paper. I mean, this is a standard. I mean, my most recent book's called A Propaganda System: How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media, and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. And I show many examples of this, not just in Latin America, many places where that's, again, it's our enemies, any problems that they might have, or any things that often they didn't even do, but we can claim they did. Big story. Much worse crimes by our allies, no story. And it gets back to, what's the policy of the government, right? The policy of the government in Honduras is to keep things nice for Gildan Activewear, big Montreal, biggest employer in Honduras, is a sweatshop employer that didn't like the fact that the Zelaya government was increasing the minimum wage. They didn't like the fact that Zelaya had continued the moratorium on new mining concessions. Goldcorp, big Vancouver, one of the biggest gold companies in the world, was not happy with that policy. So it's not, that's why I say right at the start of the talk, do not in any way believe what's happening with Canada's relationship to Venezuela is about human rights, is about democracy, is about hunger, is about whatever the things they say it's about the fundamental questions of power and corporate economic interests. That's the issue. Not to say that those other questions are there are questions around those other questions that people should discuss and that Venezuelans certainly should be discussing, but from a Canadian government perspective, that's not what's going on.
Before we turn into Nestor, I just wanted to take a couple of minutes to acknowledge, the two members of the media from the Latin American community who are here, effectively breaking the blockade, on news. Freddy Dennis, who asked the first question from Correo Canadiense, and now Nestor Castro, who is from the program Hispanic Roots. You can see his program, it's on television. Yes, so Nestor.
I would like to ask Dr. Maria Paez Victor regarding what nations are at the side of Venezuela right now?
Oh, Venezuela's not alone. There are these powerful nations against it. But, of course, Cuba. So much we have to be grateful to Cuba. So much we have to be grateful to Nicaragua, who has helped Venezuela with its agriculture. We have so much to thank Evo Morales in Bolivia, a great, great friend of Venezuela. And I want to say a huge thank you to those little countries in the Caribbean, tiny little islands, many of them, okay, who have shown more dignity than the great powerful nations, because they have stood, most of them, except the English-speaking ones, have stood with Venezuela and voted for Venezuela in the United Nations. It has been absolutely wonderful to see that kind of solidarity in many of the Caribbean nations. Apart from that, I personally believe that Venezuela has not been invaded, thank you to Russia and China. Russia and China, in no uncertain terms, have told the United States to lay off. And yes, it is true that some of it may be self-interest because they have invested a lot in Venezuela. But thank goodness for that investment. I have seen the Chinese investments in Venezuela, lovely houses where I would say ordinary, I hate to use that word, but ordinary people can go and live, not sort of the expensive high-rises that we see all over Toronto. Huh? And the Russians also have helped Venezuela in many infrastructures. So I would say to you that Venezuela is very much backed also by many African nations, because Chavez had a particular love for our ancestors, our slave ancestors who were kidnapped and brought over from Africa. And Chavez has had a great love for Africa, and many of the African countries have also voted for Venezuela in the United Nations. So it's only these powerful countries who are against us. Only these great, capitalist countries such as the United States and Canada and the EU, which, the EU, I think they've lost their sense. I don't see the Europeans having any sense of dignity and pride anymore. They've just lost their way in many, many ways. So I would say that the good countries are on Venezuela's side.
Just to thank you for the presentation, it was wonderful. We've been coming in a little late. Just a question in regards, we've been talking a lot, you guys have been talking a lot about, the allies and people in Latin America, but if you could maybe focus on, for example, Canadian allyship with, for example, the kind of things that are doing in Colombia, for example, to try and sabotage Chavez, and the kind of investment that Canada has, for example, in the region, specifically with Colombia, and then trying to break that kind of solidarity within the continent. If you can speak a little bit more about that.
Well, yeah, I mean, that was one of the things back that Harper was pushing, was really deepening ties with Colombia, partly as a counterblock to Venezuela, and signed a free trade agreement and did a series of policy measures with Colombia that was in that direction. I'm not sure about current stuff. I mean, Colombia is a hub of lots of Canadian investment and the like. But yeah, there was a tour that Harper did of Latin America in 2010, 2011, where it was very much Canada was supposed to be being shown as the alternative to the radicalism of the Bolivarian movement, and Canada sort of following that type of policy. But yeah, maybe Maria has more about the Colombia dynamic specifically.
Colombia and Venezuela used to be one country. And then in the 1800s, I think it was 1830, was it? That they divided, La Gran Colombia disappeared, and Colombia became Colombia, Venezuela. So there are few countries in the world who are so similar in culture, in history, as Colombians and Venezuelans. I myself sometimes can't distinguish. I hear a Colombian and I think he's someone from the Andes of Venezuela, or he's from the coast and they speak the same as from the coast of Venezuela. So we share the same history, much of the same culture. Our historic heroes are the same. But politically, you could not get so separate a country. Santos, and before him, that drug con man, Uribe, and I'm not insulting him, okay? I'm describing Uribe, okay? They have sunk Colombia into the mire. Okay? They have allowed seven U.S. bases on their land. Not only that, the agreement with the Americans is the following. If an American soldier commits a crime in Colombia, say he rapes a girl, oh, but the Colombian law does not apply. The US law applies. This is the kind of occupation that is happening in this dear land of Colombia, which is so close to Venezuela. And I'll tell you something. Many of the pundits say that if the United States is going to invade militarily Venezuela, it won't be the Marines. They're not going to send their blue-eyed boys down there. It's going to be through the Colombian army. The Colombian army is at least 3 times larger than the Venezuelan one. And they've had 50 years of fighting. 50 years of fighting the guerrilla. And on top of that, they have all the American, guns and armament and all of that. So why haven't they done it? I'm going to give you my own personal, I may be completely wrong, but this is what I feel. Colombia has not invaded Venezuela because they are so afraid of popular rebellion in their own country. Because the Colombians, especially along the borders, they have brothers, sisters, aunts, whatever. It's just like, those borders where people and families know each other, okay, and marry each other and all of that. And on top of that, this is astonishing, 5.8 million Colombians live, their residents, they live in Venezuela. They have been given, not just, there are some who are refugees, and Venezuela has been awarded by the United Nations Refugee Agency an award for how well they have treated the Colombians. But the rest have been given citizenship. They are citizens of Venezuela also. 5.8 million Colombians live in Venezuela. So if you ask me, one of the things that Santos and his cabinet discuss is, if we do something to Venezuela, what's going to happen to us now? Because their government is an elitist government. This is a very, very elitist society, very high class run the government. So I have a great faith in the Colombian people, and I think that most of them have suffered immensely by their 2 governments, and many of them see with good eyes what is happening in Venezuela, and most of them wish they had what the Venezuelans have right now. They don't get a bag of food twice a month, and they know that they have been treated with great dignity when they have crossed over. By the way, you have heard in the media that there's an exodus of Venezuelans going off to Colombia. Well, 65% of those who are traveling to Colombia are actually Colombians. And the Colombian government, because they have the Venezuelan pass or citizenship, doesn't want to recognize them. And most of them are this floating people that live on both sides or always travel back and forth. So there isn't an exodus. And yet, why isn't the powers that be worried that 5.8 million Colombians chose to leave Colombia to live in Venezuela? Could it be that in Colombia there's more violence and more insecurity for their lives than there is in Venezuela? I put it to you that that is the case.
So we have 2 last. So We have time for 2 more questions. Compañero over here.
Thank you for sharing all this things are going on in Venezuela and the Canadian role in this situation. My question is for both of you on the panel, and it's part of like how do you see? I mean, Canada is a threat, like their foreign policy is a threat. What's going on in Venezuela for sure, and what is its force and influence in other countries in South America where the situation is also like the situation is bad because a neoliberal government took place, which is the case in Brazil, what happened in Argentina, and how, for example, like countries like these two can influence in some sort of like regime change strategy from imperialist forces. So how and how can this sort of like work in South America can be done for like countries to kind of like avoid any sort of like local invasion or support to regime change in Venezuela, because at least from what I know in Brazil, we're having elections this year, and the candidates, especially like from the left, they're being asked whether or not they support Venezuela. And if they do, of course, the corporate media, they're like right away attacking them with the same sort of like approach they have here in Canada, right? So how is that game being articulated, and from what you know, and how you see as like what it would be for the countries who are on the side of Venezuela and some in Latin America, what they can do in terms of like support even more or kind of build a stronger movement there, right? Especially when you see like Mercosur, for instance, where Venezuela was always like trying to, like Argentina and Brazil were always trying to kick them out of the group, right? So how do you see all that thing happening?
Well, on Mercosur, Canada's in negotiations to join Mercosur, right? Just in recent days, and it's kind of presented in the media reports I've seen in the context of Venezuela having been kicked out. Now, louder? Oh, sorry. I think that I made this point, and I think Canada does provide some legitimacy to the Lima Group, and having Chrystia Freeland involved in that, and also the sanctions provide the fact it's not just the U.S. provides a little bit more cover for more right-wing Latin American governments to kind of ramp things up. They like that. As I mentioned earlier, and I kind of meant to restate, I saw an article, I think it was Jamaica, I think it was a Canadian official, I'm not sure if it was Freeland or if it was another person from Foreign Affairs, just like about a week or 10 days ago, had a meeting with Jamaica and was prodding Jamaica, because I think Jamaica has taken a pretty principled position, was prodding Jamaica to go, sort of against Venezuela, and Freeland applauded Suriname and another country, I forget what countries I have it in my notes there, when they sort of provided some degree of sympathy to Lima Group. So I do think Canada is playing a role in the Caribbean. Canada's been a major power in the Caribbean for a long time, and a lot of those Caribbean countries have refused to go along at the OAS and elsewhere. So there's that. Obviously, Maria probably understands the sort of bigger geopolitical dynamic in Latin America better. But if Lula was to win the election in Brazil, I think that will have a big effect on weakening some of the hostility. And in Lopez Obrador, again in the same kind of context where they're going after him. The right-wing media in Mexico goes after him for being sympathetic to Venezuela. I don't know if he was to win the election. I think there's a chance that he would pursue a different type of policy than the current government in Mexico. I think Canada is definitely there. There is some impact regionally in terms of it's not the U.S. There's a degree of credibility, and also in the Caribbean particularly, there's actually real power that Canada has.
Canada, I think Linda McQuaig said it beautifully. Canada's on the wrong side of history.
On the wrong side of history.
That is Linda McQuaig's phrase, and it's so true. In a sense, Canada seems to only look south up to the United States. And when it looks further south, it only looks at it, again, through those eyes. And it's losing a great opportunity. Canada used to have a very good reputation of a sort of a middle, sort of Switzerland sort of thing. When I speak to people in Latin America, that's all gone. Canada is seen as the U.S.'s poodle, you know, doing the dirty work here and there. Certainly in Venezuela, this has certainly happened. But there's going to be 7 elections this year in Latin America. I think there's 7. And things are looking good for Lula in Brazil, but things are looking bad for Brazil because people are even saying there might be a coup. We don't know whether it's going to be right wing or left wing, but certainly Lula's star seems to be rising. In Mexico, if Andrés López Obrador does not win, I can assure you there's going to be blood on the streets of Mexico. They're not going to take this. Two times they have stolen the election for him. And right now, all the polls are saying that he is going to win. So much so that Trump is pressuring Canada to accept the NAFTA deals because they want to get the NAFTA deal before López Obrador wins. So this is how much even the Americans know that he's going to win. So there is hope. The Lima Group is a minority group in the Organization of American States, since they couldn't get the Organization of American States, even with Almagro against Venezuela, to vote against Venezuela. They decided that they, the minority group, were going to form the Group of Lima. As Diosdado Cabello says, el grupo de Grima, instead of Lima. And what was their great Grima means disgust or grime, right? So what was their great flag that they were going forward with? Against corruption, because the Venezuelan government is corrupt. And who fell? Their leader, Kuczynski, fell with his hands, you know, in the money. So they are a spent force. It is a shame that Canada, you know, linked its wagon to these group of gangsters who are leading these wonderful countries, okay? Because this is the sad thing that we, who have a citizenship here, should tell our representatives. You are uniting with gangsters, with narco-traffic people, with killers, with death squads. This is where you are dragging Canada down. We should not accept that, okay? And no NAFTA, no economic, benefit should take precedence over ethical and moral principles. That's what I
think. Wondering, given that the elections are just around the corner, are we like a civil society, international observers to go down to Venezuela for the day of the elections?
Unfortunately, you missed, signing up. But Venezuela has always had hundreds of international observers. This year, they have asked the United Nations to be witnesses. So you know what the opposition says? Oh no, they're up there pressuring the United Nations not to go down to. This is like absurd. This is absurd. If you think the elections are rigged, send these observers down there. So the United Nations is going to send observers. The Organization of American States has always begged to send observers. The government has said no because the Organization of American States is such a corrupt place. But this time they're saying, sure, come along. Remember this, ex-president of the United States, Jimmy Carter, ex-president of the United States, has this group called Carter Group, and they go around, Carter what? Center. They go around observing elections in the world. They have observed 93 elections. And Jimmy Carter has said that the electoral process of Venezuela is the best in the world. That's why they don't want those observers down there.
Final question, yes, next.
I would like to ask you this question regarding there is many migrations to Colombia, to Ecuador, to Peru, people from Venezuela. Now, Canada and United States, they are doing a hardship, economical hardship to Venezuela economy, imposing sanctions. It's possible that the moral obligation of the government of Canada to receive more Venezuelans here too?
I would say no. I don't think they have a moral obligation. Do you think you're going to let in, you're going to let in, give priority to the upper class? What?
Sorry, just to repeat the question.
Oh.
Yeah, so the question was essentially whether Canada has a moral
The
obligation
obligation
to
to
accept
receive
to accept-
people who are coming out from
people
Venezuela.
who are coming to Canada from Venezuela.
Because of the sanctions.
Or
Because of the
sanctions.
sanctions. Because of the sanctions.
Do you think that a middle-class person from Venezuela should be given any kind of priority from, let's say, a Syrian, someone from Afghanistan, someone from El Congo, someone from countries that are really having enormous hardship with governments that really aren't helping them? So who are the Venezuelans that come here? Well, everyone is individual. They want to come here, fine. But to ask, oh, I'm really poor, come and help me. This is a sham. This is what they're using the goodwill of the Venezuelan immigration offices. You know, I have known Venezuelans that have arrived here and said they were refugees, and because of the system, you know, takes a long time. They receive money, they receive, you know, health, all kinds of things, and it takes maybe a year or 2 years. And you know what I heard a Venezuelan say to me? Says, "Oh, you can go as a refugee to Canada, and you can even go to school, and you'll get money and everything, and then maybe after a year or two they'll throw you out, but at least you'll do that." They are milking the system, these people that come here. And the ones that come here aren't the ones in the, you know, the poor parts of Venezuela. Everybody's been giving all this money and all these houses and everything. These are the middle class who long for their Heinz ketchup, basically.
Amigos de Hispanic Room, nos encontramos con el autor del libro The Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, Mr. Yves Engler. No? Could you tell me, please, regarding the book, when was the publication of this book?
Oh, well, that was actually published in 2009. It was a book that looks at Canadian foreign policy from a critical perspective, and in terms of Latin America in specific, it details the Canadian naval vessel that in 1921 off the coast of Costa Rica forced the Costa Rican government to repay an odious debt to the Royal Bank of Canada. It details Canada's in 1932 in El Salvador, where there was a terrible massacre, and there was 2 Canadian gunboats that provided support for the dictatorship as they repressed the movement there, including killing Farabundo Martí. It shows a history of Canada's role in corporate role in Brazil, where the Canadian Octopus Brascan, a Canadian company that had its tentacles in so many areas of Brazilian economy, backed the fascist forces in a lead up to the coup against Goulart in '64. It looks at Canada's role in undermining Salvador Allende in Chile, and right up until today, it's a history of Canadian foreign policy more generally, but has a significant chapter, one big chapter on Latin America and a big chapter also on the Caribbean.
But you being a Canadian, why you are always against the establishment?
Well, I think that this is being done in my name. Anyone who's living here to some extent is being done in their name, and if you don't agree with those policies, it's beholden on people to speak out and to oppose those policies. And you know, there's a fair bit of freedom in the society to speak out. I mean, you get marginalized in terms of getting into the dominant media, but you know, there's not people coming and throwing people into jail, or you're not likely to get harmed. So there's a great deal of freedom, and that comes with that. I think there's a responsibility that leads to if Canada is involved in overthrowing an elected government in Haiti in 2004, which it was, it's important for people who don't support that to stand up and to organize and to speak and mobilize against that.
Yeah. Many of your years writing books, always the books are very well known in general. Could you say the name of a few of these books?
Well, I have a number of books. So my most recent book's called The Propaganda System: How Canada's Government, Corporations, Media and Academia Sell War and Exploitation. Previous one to that is Canada in Africa, 300 Years of Aid and Exploitation. Another one is called The Ugly Canadian, Stephen Harper's Foreign Policy, about obviously the former Prime Minister. A book called Lester Pearson's Peacekeeping, The Truth May Hurt. Another book about cars. A book on Canada and Israel, Building Apartheid, that looks at the history of Canadian support for Palestinian dispossession, the Black Book of Canadian Foreign Policy, also a book called Canada and Haiti, co-authored book, Canada and Haiti, Waging War Against the Poor Majority, about the 2004 coup in Haiti, and then another book about my time as a student activist at Concordia University.
Yeah. How do you feel the feedback of your audience, the ones who read your book?
Well, I'm telling a different story than appears in the corporate media. So people, for the most part, are astounded by the facts and details that I uncover, and so lots of people are happy and that I produce the books. Often people feel depressed because it seems like a grim situation. But the reality is that people might feel bad that their mythology about Canada being this force for good, that they might feel challenged in that mythology, and that might lead to people being in bad spirits for a couple hours or something like that. But it's infinitely it's very unimportant compared to what these policies actually mean for many people's lives. So and obviously the first step to changing policy is always to learn about and to know about, and information is the first step. Now, obviously, we also need people to act and to mobilize and to vote and to take information beyond just passivity. But people generally have a positive reception to the books.
Yeah. To write one of these books really take a lot of time. What is your main source of research?
I read a dozen newspapers every day. I have Google News searches. Google. Yeah, I have Google News thing. Canada, Venezuela, Google News Alert. Canada, Haiti, Google News Alert. Canada Mining, Google. I have like about 60, 70. I get way too many emails from Google every day. But the main thing is if you know. The academic, a lot of this information is actually done by academics that detail, get access to the archives. So, for instance, let's take Canada's role in the assassination of Patrice Lumumba in the Congo in the early 1960s. It's actually quite well documented by the internal files of external affairs at the time. There's a good book on it. There's a couple of theses from a master's student, so the information's kind of out there. A lot of the information's out there, but it's just kind of like buried deep in an academic library that almost no one bothers to ever sort of look at. And big part of what I do is take that academic research that's been done and help sort of publicize it and synthesize it and make it a little bit more digestible and give a bit bigger history, bigger kind of context. It's not just in Congo, right? It's just like it's important in the case of Canada's role in undermining the Venezuelan government today. It's important to know that this isn't just an anomaly. This is, they're doing some bad policies, and obviously needs to be opposed. But there's a broader pattern, and we shouldn't be trusting our politicians when it comes to Canadian foreign policy. Most people assume the best of Canadian decision makers. What that does is that lulls the population into just accepting, oh yeah, they're doing something good. They tell us they're doing something good in Venezuela, so therefore they're doing something good. When the history suggests the total opposite, which overwhelmingly the things that motivate Canadian foreign policy is support for empire, historically the British, today the American, and support for Canadian corporate interests abroad. That is overwhelmingly what has driven Canadian foreign policy, and the whole mythology and the ideology of benevolent Canada is something that's been created by different power structures with the intent of driving the population into passivity on foreign policy questions, assuming the best. And if you assume the best of what Chrystia Freeland's doing vis-a-vis Venezuela today, the chance of opposing that is very unlikely. So yeah, a lot of the information's out there. It's a matter of trying to publicize it and mobilize people behind it.
What is the name of your last book you are writing right now for our audience, and maybe they will be interested to read about?
Yeah, I will have a book coming out in the fall about the left-wing, Canadian left-wing's foreign policy. I also am working on a book called A People's History of the Canadian Military, which is just this is going to be quite a significant project that looks at just a critical lens of the Canadian military, which is this massive institution that we give more than $20 billion in taxpayer money to every year. It has its arms in terms of universities, in terms of research, in terms of spying, all kinds of areas that most people have very little sort of knowledge about.
Thank you very much for your information. For sure, our audience will read your book because your books look very interesting, really.
Thank you.